So good morning, thank you for coming. This session is called Getting Started with Web Development and the ArcGIS API for JavaScript. So my name is Noah Sager. I'm a product engineer on the JavaScript team, and I'm here with...
I'm Heather Gonzago. Again, I'm a product engineer at the JavaScript team. And yeah, that's it.
Keep it simple.
Yeah.
All right. So let's start off with a quick show of hands. How many people here have already done some web development using JavaScript? Throw your hands out. All right, almost everyone. Awesome. Now, how many of you have done the same development using the JavaScript API, a 3.x version? Okay, a couple people. And the 4.x version? A couple people. Cool. Okay, so we have a bunch of web developers. You're used to JavaScript, but the API is going to be kind of new. So this is going to be a getting started session. We're going to cover a big overview of what's going on with the API.
Ask a question. I'm just curious. How many are geographers by trade and we're told they need to figure all of this stuff out? Yeah, okay. That was me like 18 years ago, so I get it. So this is a good one for you.
All right, so this is our agenda. First, we're going to go over the setup, and that's both in terms of web development and in terms of developing with the ArcGIS API for JavaScript, so we'll give you the very basics. And then we're going to do something kind of cool. Instead of just showering you with code snippets and useful tidbits of information, we're going to build an app from scratch. So each segment will go over the principles and the fundamentals behind it, and then we'll add layers of complexity to our application. So we'll work with layers, we'll work with symbology and renderers, make the map a little interactive, use a portal, lowercase p portal, and add some widgets to it. Then you'll see how we go from nothing all the way to a fully functional web application. So a quick bit of housekeeping. So we're going to be talking about the 4.x version of the API today. The current version is 4.6. A lot of the principles are going to apply to the 3.x version of the API, and we'll get into some of the differences between the 3.x version and the 4.x version later on in the session. But all of this presentation and ones that Heather has done in years past, which does cover the 3.x version of the API, that's all going to be available on GitHub. So if you want to take a moment and take a picture or just jot down this URL, or you can Google GitHub Heather Gonzago and you'll find her Dev Summit presentation repository.
The 3x one's a little old, but again, like you said, it updated data and so forth. But that is actually not going to be under the Dev Summit. If you go to my H Gonzago repo, I think there should be one for the user conference that I did. So if you want to take a look back on there, you should be able to access that as well.
And this will be the presentations and all the demos that we're going to show today and the ones that Heather has shown in the past. So this can be a good learning repository. All right, so we'll move on. So where do I begin? So the first place that we recommend beginning is the developer's website, developers.arcgis.com/JavaScript. You'll notice when you first open it opens up at the 4.x version of the API. Over on the right side, there's a little blue box that'll bring you to the 3.x version of the API. But this is the main landing page that's been completely revamped at the 4.x version, and we're pretty proud of it. So there's a couple sections I want to highlight. The first is the guide. This is a conceptual guide area, and maybe I'll make it a little bit bigger. It has a lot of good information about fundamentals of working with the API, things like the release notes for the current version, or the system requirements that are necessary to actually develop applications. We have a migrating from 3.x topic, and then we have a lot of really useful topics about working with the API. Everything from arcade to promises to actually developing your own custom widget. This is all written in English with some code snippets and links to samples, but it's really to give you that conceptual foundation to actually begin working with the API. We have a section on visualization, and then we have a handy reference section for things like proxy pages or localization. All that useful stuff is right there. The next section I want to highlight is the API reference. This is kind of like a cookbook for making those delicious web applications. And the really cool part about it, if you're coming from the 3.x world, we've added a search bar here. So if I'm working with pop-ups and I know that I need pop-ups for my map, I can just do a search for pop-up. And it's going to show me all the classes and all the different modules that have pop-up properties or that implement pop-ups. And then I can easily navigate into any one of these classes. The next tab is the sample code. This is where all of our samples are. And it's organized by category. You can see in the table of contents. But it also has the same ability to search. So I can search for a pop-up, and it's going to show me there's 13 samples that use pop-ups. And each of these samples will have descriptions about what the sample does, and then shows you an actually fully interactive application. And the last thing to point out is the community tab. So how many people here are familiar with or have at least heard about GeoNet? Okay, cool, a good portion of you. So GeoNet is the Esri community. It replaced the Esri forum site, if you're familiar with that, and actually has more functionality than the Esri forum site. It's a great place to post questions, to post answers, post ideas, and kind of get help from the community. And it's also free. So if you're a student or if you're working on your own, you don't have to pay money to join the Esri community. There's a bunch of other online forums like it, but this is Esri's version of it, and it's really awesome. All right, so question, which version of the API is best? So I alluded to in the beginning that we have a 3.x version and a 4.x version, and technically those are both current versions of the API. The 4.x version, we've completely rebuilt the API when we completely rebuilt the API at the 4.x version, but we still have functionality being added at the 3.x version, but most of our development resources are being put in the 4.x version. There will come a time in the future, we don't know when yet, but it will be, eventually, that 3.x will stop being worked on and 4.x will be the main version of the API. So if you're sitting there wondering which version should I start with, this page is really helpful to choose between the version page. If you have requirements to make a web application that say needs to be in 3D, you can immediately tell that 3.x does not have support for 3D, but 4.x does. So that tells you should start working with the 4.x version of the API. But if you need to work with something like time-enabled data, we don't have that yet at 4.x, so you're going to want to start working with the 3.x version of the API. So this page is great when you're getting started to see which version you can work with. All things being equal, you should work with the 4.x version unless you need to use 3.x. Another cool thing here, if you're coming from the 3.x world or you have an old code you need to migrate, we have a functionality matrix. So a lot of modules have either been removed, added, or renamed in the migration from 3 to 4, and you can find what those naming conventions are now. So my favorite layer is the ArcGIS Dynamic Map Service layer. It's a bit of a mouthful. We still have it at 4.x, but it's been renamed to Map Image layer. So if you want to port your code from 3 to 4, I think you can kind of get the sense that it's not as easy as just replacing a few classes. It's going to be a complete rewrite. So this table can be really helpful to find those functions and methods that you're usually used to working with. All right, so now developer setup. So if you've come from a different language, if you've worked with iOS, you've been programming with Swift or Objective-C, or you've done some Android or Java development, you're really limited in the IDEs that you can use. And that's not so with JavaScript. You have a lot of options. If you just do a Google for the best JavaScript IDE, you'll find a bajillion articles. This is a nice one that we found recently that we'd like to show off. The first one at the top of the list is Visual Studio Code. This is being used a lot on our team. It's free, it's fairly lightweight, and does a really good job of working with projects. Other ones that I personally like are things like Sublime or Notepad++, a bit more lightweight, fewer bells and whistles, but they open up real quick and just let you kind of dive into the code. And then if you're like more tools, if you like all the bells and whistles, WebStorm is a great option. We have some developers that use that, and you can do everything that you want. So there's a lot of different options out there, and there is no one correct answer for which one is best. Okay, more resources. So I showed you the developers.arcgis.com page. We also have a JSAPI Resources page on GitHub. This has a lot of cool stuff. This is things like if you want help with working with other frameworks like Bower, or you want some help with OAuth, or you want to learn more about TypeScript or JS Hint. We have a lot of cool resources here on this GitHub page, and there are links to it within the developer page. But this is the URL to the actual page on GitHub. So there's a lot of cool stuff here that can kind of help you with your projects. All right, getting the API. So there's 3 ways to actually work with the JavaScript API. The most popular is the CDN version. This is the content delivery network that Esri hosts. So we maintain access to the API 24/7. So all you have to do is add this URL in, and you'll see this on the developer page, and at every sample, a link to the URL, and then we update that when a new version comes out. Another thing you can do is actually make a custom build. So we have things like Bower. If you're familiar with that, you can package your own build of the API. One of the benefits to this is if you know exactly the functionality you want and you want a bit of a smaller payload for loading the API, you just grab the modules that you want and package them together and then download that. The only caveat there is if you make changes to your application or you want to add functionality, you're going to need to do a new download. So if you do that quite often, that can be a pain, but if you know exactly what you're doing, this is a great option as well. And the last option is to actually download and host it yourself. So we have a lot of customers that work in secure environments, and they don't want to be making web requests to outside their network. So you can download the API and the SDK and host it on your own machine. So you can have our documentation, you can have our samples, and have the API reference that you can just call locally in your web application. Again, the caveat there is when new versions come out, you'll have to download it again and set it up again. It's a very small amount of effort to actually set it up, but it is a bit of effort compared to just calling URL. All right, same thing with the CSS. So we have two different CSS files. You can again use the CDN version where you just make the call to where Esri hosts it. The main.css is the easiest because it has everything. Anything you would want to style for Esri is in the main.css file. So that makes it really straightforward. However, if you're doing some more lighter weight things, you don't want to have to download or make requests to the entire CSS file, you can use the view.css. The view.css is good for a simple map or just using a couple widgets. That's a little bit lighter, but still gives you the functionality that you need. And then the last thing you can do, which I always find kind of neat, is themes. So if you've ever seen a web application that doesn't have the default coloring on the widgets or on the zoom bar or things like that, you can actually define the theme. You can make it purple or green or kind of customize it a bit. If your company has a certain branding or if you have a favorite color, it's pretty straightforward, as the documentation says, to do. You just make a call to the theme CSS file and just insert the theme name in the string here. All right, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather, and she's going to take you through the first steps to making the application.
All right, so all of that out of the way, let's actually go in and create this thing. So one of the first things that you're probably going to want to consider is how your app is actually going to be written. If you take a look at our developer site, you'll notice that all of our samples are written in one, we just have them in one HTML file, just for simplicity's sake. So if we open up this map, you see we have everything, all of it in one file, all right? Well, once you see your application starts to get a little bit larger, you're probably gonna wanna go in and start breaking it down, more modularize it. So that's what we have done for all of our demos. Just to show you, I have everything in here so I have a CSS file stored here in my CSS folder. I've got a JavaScript file, which is going to hold the actual JavaScript that has all of our stuff in this main.js file. That's in this JavaScript folder. And then the index.html file, so that markup. Okay, so that's how we do it within our demos. You don't have to do it that way, but just to kind of give you an idea, once again, you know, the larger your projects get, you probably want to go in and work on it this way. All right, so first things first. Get out of here. Let's open one up. All right, so this is a really ugly map, but it is a map. What we have here is basically just looking at my main.js file, and I have an extension on my machine to make things look a little bit easier. All right, so what we have here is a require statement, and I'm passing in the Esri map and a map view, okay? And then I'm passing in the arguments for this. So this function call, map and map view. All right, so these are the variable names for my map view. Or for that argument, I should say, I'm sorry. Now I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna instantiate a map, create the new map, set my base map to one of the given base maps that we have provided for you, just hosted ArcGIS Online base maps, and there's a bunch of them. This one's just the gray vector. And then we've got a map view. The map view is a little bit different if you aren't familiar with 4x and you've only worked with 3x in the past. The map is what is the container. That's what's holding all of your data. So all of your layers are going to get added directly to your map. But the map view itself is how that data is rendered, how it's actually displayed, all right? It's the view of that map or how you view that map. one of the cool things between going from 3 to 4 is, this is something that people used to ask a lot back in 3, was I want to be able to have multiple maps within my application. You could do it, it was just a bit of work. You can do it now with 4 much easier by having multiple, you can have multiple views referencing the same map, just maybe in a different location, different extent, whatever it may be, but it can be referencing that same map. I'm going to come back to Noah. Can you give your analogy? I like it. He told me this once. He's like, "This is how I think of the map view," and I was like, "I want you to say that during the intro session." So
if it's confusing to you, and it certainly was to me, the way I used to think about it is a map is kind of like your backyard, and so you'd have some data back there, like a garden. Maybe you have a swing set and some trees. And the view on the map is like a window from your house. So you could have a downstairs window, you could have an upstairs window, you could have a stained glass window in your garage, and your backyard or your map is going to look different depending on your view or on your window. So each window or each view can have a different view of the same map.
once you play around with it a little bit more, I think it gets easier as well. So, all right. So what I want to show you is if we actually take a look, let's look at the code. Go into the index file, because this is actually what gets loaded up first. So within that index file, I am referencing our JavaScript API. I'm referencing this from the CDN. Okay, so if you're not sure of the syntax of how to actually do this, you're going to go to the developer's help, front page, just copy and paste. We have the same thing equivalent. We have the equivalent of that within 3 as well on the front page. So just copy and paste, and then put that here within your markup, okay? I'm also adding the main.js file as well, all right? And we also have a CSS file that I'm working with. So the CSS is basically just how that markup is being styled, all right? So I'm basically just telling it, hey, I want this view div element that I have, which is what my map is in, I want it to take up the full height and width of my application. So it's gonna take up everything, all right? So down here, I also have this div that I created, this view div. That's important because that is what you pass in to the container property off of the map view. So it knows, hey, we're creating this map view, we're gonna put it into this view div, and within this map view, we're gonna show the map with this gray vector base map. I could actually go in here and change this out. Probably need to clear my cache. Yeah, and you can see here that it just changed it out, and this is the actual streets base map layer. If you have your own base maps that you want to use, you can configure that and use those as well. And all of that's written up within our documentation. So this is not probably going to help you guys out all that much, though. I mean, it's huge. You're zoomed out so far. So what you'll want to do, I'm going to show you a couple little tips and tricks here. So I'm going to zoom into a location. Okay, so we just have the United States. All right. So if I open up my, in this case, I'm in Chrome. You can open up your developer tools. And if you're not familiar with the developer tools and you haven't used that, you don't have to use Chrome. Every browser has them. Get familiarized with it because it is definitely going to be, you're going to be in it on a daily basis. So if you open up your developer tools, which I have here in this case, I'm going to go in and take a look, scroll up a little bit. Let's refresh. Okay, you can see here in this main file, I have this var view. I have this global variable that I created, okay? And the reason I made it a global variable is because I want to be able to run this application, and I want to be able to go in and inspect certain properties after I run it. So I want to inspect some view properties. So what I'm going to do is within the console tab, let's zoom in again. It's kind of hard with that. There we go. There, okay. So within that console tab, if I did view.center.latitude I could type latitude, you'll see here it's given me the latitude of my center location on that view that I'm currently looking at. I can do the same thing for longitude as well. I'm pretty lazy. This makes things a lot easier for me. A lot of times you don't want to have to go in, you're working with your app, you don't know the extent. You can set the extent as well when you first create your application. You can set the extent off of that view. Or in this case, you can set like the scale and the center location, which is what we're going to do. There's also view scale. You can grab the scale. So I've done this before or prior to this, so I'm going to go ahead and just copy this out. Put it back in my code. Save it. And now you can see that instead of having that full huge extent, it's zoomed in further to the United States. One thing I didn't mention, and Noah's going to talk about it a bit more in depth, was these properties that I set are directly off the constructor itself. So that's another really cool thing when working with 4X, is that you can do all of this when instantiating your instance of, like in this case, the map view. All right, am I missing anything else on that? I think we're good. Okay. I always feel like I've got so much I want to say, but I'm not sure how much time. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the, not a little bit, I talked about the map view. You can do the same thing. The same concepts apply when working with a scene view. All right, so if you're working with 3D data, same exact concepts, create that new scene view, and then pass the container in, and then again, you just pass that map in, just like what you did with the map view. The properties are slightly different, but all of that is documented within our documentation, so you can just go in there and, you know, if that is something that you're interested in, you can just play around with that and see what works best for you. All right, so some of the things that I wanted to talk about here, and I absolutely guarantee that at least one person in here will do it. If not, you have done it already. When you work with your applications, the module order and how you set up like your require statements. So for example, require Esri map, require Esri views map view. Oh, I'm going to go backwards just 1 second. I forgot to show you guys this. If you go back to the documentation, I knew I was forgetting something. If you go to the documentation, I'm just going to search for map. I showed you all those require statements. How do you know what to actually put in? How do you know where everything belongs? What's the right syntax? You're going to get that at the very top of each class. We provide that syntax for you. So require Esri /map. Casing does matter in this case because I have gotten myself thrown off many times with a lowercase m and it doesn't work. And then we just call, these are the preferred aliases. You can actually call this anything you want. My map, this map, it's a map, doesn't matter. As long as the order in how you specify these require statements and the arguments is exactly the same. So if you went in here and said, all right, map view, map, and then started to use some of the map classes off of, because that's basically what's going to happen. It's going to think, hey, this is a map. You're trying to use map view functionality off of the map. So if we run it, sometimes you get errors, sometimes just nothing happens. So in this particular case, I'm going to just be able to refresh. Yeah, nothing happens. All right, and it's just mainly because it's such a basic application. But a lot of times you'll get errors like property not found or property not defined. You get things like that. That's the very, very first thing to take a look at. Maybe you were doing some copying and pasting. You decided you didn't need to use certain functionality, so you removed some of it, but you forgot to take it out of the require statement. So now you've got 5 require statements, but 4 arguments that you're passing in. All right, the DOM ready, I should probably mention that doesn't have one, so don't worry about that. That's going to be empty. That's going to be at the end. All right. What else here? I think gotchas. Okay. Another one is if it can't find your CSS file. So for example, let's say I'm going to add there, or that one doesn't matter. We'll add something weird in there. I changed the URL for the main CSS file. So if I go in here, did I update this? Make sure I updated this. No, I didn't. Okay. All right, empty that cache. All right, it still shows it. And you may see that sometimes you'll see empty tiles, but what you may notice here is, well, you notice the error message I'm getting, but another thing you'll notice is that I don't get the default zoom in and zoom out buttons. I don't get the attribution that shows up. That comes in by default off of the View UI, and it is dependent upon that CSS. So if you can't see it, it's not going to show up. So that's one thing. Any other ones? Okay, yeah, I think that's it. So those are the two big ones, but mainly that module order. Just keep that in mind because like I said, I guarantee one person in here will get stuck on that. All right, so we added our map. That's great. There's a base map data in there, but you probably need to actually do something with it. You might have your own operational layers that you're working with. So we provide various layer types that you can use to access your operational layers and bring them in and overlay them on your map. There's a bunch of different types that we provide for you. Within the API reference, if you just go in and take a look for Esri layers, you'll see all of them listed here. I mean, they range everywhere from like GeoRSS layers to tile layers, vector tile layers, and so forth. Okay, so basically, it's going to be dependent upon the type of layer that you're actually working on. In our particular demo, we're working with feature layers. The thing that I want you to keep in mind, it does not matter the type of layer that you're working on. The sequence of events that you need to do within your code is always going to remain the same. So you need to load your module. So basically meaning go in and require that Esri layers feature layer or Esri layers vector tile layer or whatever it is that you're working with. You're going to instantiate that. So like in this case, var, I've got a point layer that I'm using, instantiate that, and then set whatever properties it is that you want to set within your layer. And then lastly, you're going to want to make sure then it's not going to do a whole lot until you add that to your map. Okay, so there's a couple different ways Noah's going to show you, but you're going to want to make sure you require it correctly, you instantiate it, you set the properties, and then you add it to your map. All right, so you want to show?
Sure.
Or talk a little bit, I guess, about properties?
Right. Okay, so speaking of setting properties, let's dive in real quick. There's some cool things you can do at 4.x when you're setting and getting properties, and one of them is actually defining them in the constructor. So at the top here, I have some statements that set the properties in individual lines. So I create a variable called map. I set the map.basemap to be streets, the map.ground to world elevation. Then I create a view and set the view.center to an array of points, and then the view.zoom to a zoom value. Contrastingly, I could just set all those up in the maps constructor. So below I have a var map equals new map, and then I can pass in a series of properties and values. So there I can define the base map and the ground being the world elevation. And the same thing for the view. I define what the map is that I'm using, the center and the zoom. And so of course, what I really want to point out is you all seem to have experience with JavaScript, so what will be really helpful will be the guide topic on these things that we're talking about. So we have a ton of these guide topics. One is specific to working with properties, and this is a very readable way to kind of dive in and get more familiar with getting and setting properties using the 4.x version of the API. So there's code snippets and a lot of really readable English. Okay, so another thing you want to do with properties is watch when they change. So if you're coming from 3.x, you're used to events. We used to have map events, and we had on-click events and double-click events and zoom events and pan events. all these ways that your users might interact with your web application, you might want to have the application do something with those events. At 3.x, it was a little limited because if we didn't expose an event in the API, then you couldn't do anything with it. At 4.x, you can watch for any property that's defined. So all you have to do is create a watch statement, tell it the property you want to watch, and then tell it to do something. So in this layer here, we're watching for the load status on a layer in the code snippet. And then we have a function that's going to do something once the map is loaded. So you might want to have a dependency waiting for a map to be loaded, or you might want to have a little fun pop-up when someone clicks on your map that tells them, some useful information. And of course, we have a whole guide topic about watch for changes, and we have a really cool sample here that can highlight the functionality. So this is pretty straightforward. It's just going to watch for a bunch of layer added properties to fire off, and if the extent gets changed. So on the right, they have a div where it's going to print out all that information. And if I pan and zoom the map, it's going to get more messages over on the right side. So this might not be what you want to do in your enterprise application, but it's a good proof of concept that shows you how you can watch for all these different variable properties and how you can actually do something with them. So that's a useful sample to have. Okay, so now let's see another demo where we actually add the layer to the map. So Heather showed you a map before that was a nice light gray base map, and now we've actually added a layer of data to it. So it's pretty straightforward. We're just adding one level of complexity. But let's open up the developer tools and see what that code actually looks like. So initially, it's going to show the index page. And if you've ever worked with JavaScript, you know that sometimes it's not going to show you the JavaScript files right away. So if I refresh it, it should come up in just a moment. There's the JavaScript folder. And so this is what it looks like. So it's pretty straightforward. I have 2 points. And just so you have a frame of reference, we're going to be looking at private school attendance and public school attendance as our sample data for these examples. So I have one layer that's going to be points, and I create a feature layer, var private school point equal new feature layer. And then I have a polygon layer, var private school poly equals new feature layer. And I just assign it to a URL. And this is being hosted in ArcGIS Online. I can get the REST endpoint and just easily create a feature layer from it. And then all I have to do is, once the view has been loaded, I'm going to use a view.when statement to actually add the layer to the map. So all this information, the map and the view, is the same as the first example, but now I'm taking it one step further and just adding one layer to the map. And so again, this might not be your ultimate goal, but we're just showing levels of complexity getting added. Okay, now renderers. So we added a layer, and that was using the default symbology that was captured when the layer was created, but maybe I actually want to style it. So rendering is a way to define a set of rules for how your information is going to be visualized on the map. So you typically need one renderer per type of layer. So you can have a renderer for a point layer, renderer for a polygon layer, renderer for a polyline layer, and then you can use a set of symbology that's going to tell the map how to display the data. So in this code snippet, this is very basic, but I'm going to create a renderer. It's going to be a unique value renderer, which means apply a different symbology to a different type of data. I'm going to tell it which layer to use. So the URL is going to the feature layer URL. And then I'm actually going to pass in the renderer in my feature layer constructor, the renderer that I create up here, to that renderer. And of course, if you're interested in rendering and getting more information, we have a whole visualization topic that will go much more into detail on how to do rendering and all the different layer types that we have. But we're going to show you a basic example. But you have the renderer, and what you want to use with the renderer is a symbol, because you actually want to symbolize the data. So let's take a look at some symbology. So in this code snippet, I'm going to create a new symbol, and it's going to be a simple marker symbol. And again, you can dig into the API reference, see all the different symbols that we have. But I'm going to create my renderer, and I'm going to use as a default symbol this symbol here. So basically, in a renderer that I'm going to show you in a minute, you're going to see a couple different classes there for different types of data. But it's nice to have a default symbol for any data you have that doesn't quite fall into those categories. So basically, some symbols and renderers work hand in hand. Okay, and the last thing to touch on that you're going to see in the sample is going to be autocasting. So Heather mentioned the importance of modules. You have them in the require statement, and you give them a local argument name. But not all classes in the 4.x version of the API have to have a require statement. They can be autocast. And autocast means that the API is smart enough to know that when you create something like a unique value renderer, you don't have to require unique value renderer, give it a name. It'll know how to get it automatically. We're always adding more classes to be autocastable. And the way that you'll know is if you go into the API reference, you're going to see this autocast image here. next to it, and that tells you you don't have to actually require it. You still can. Sometimes Heather likes to require it anyway. It's not going to hurt anything, but you don't have to do it. And of course, we have a whole autocasting guide if you want to learn more about that. The nice thing about our samples is that if a property can be autocast, you're going to see a comment in the code telling you this can be autocast. That's why you don't see it in the require statement. So you'll quickly get comfortable with how autocasting works. But it's really nice because it gives you fewer lines of code and it makes your code a little bit easier to read. So let's go ahead and look at the example. Okay, so now we're going to combine the power of autocasting with rendering and symbology. So this again is that same map, but if you notice it looks a little bit different. We've got some nice shades of color there and we have a cool little image for our points layer. Well, let's actually open that up and see what the code is doing here. Okay, so the index.html file hasn't changed very much. All the magic is going to happen in the .js file. And once that loads up, we'll go ahead and take a look at it. And the Wi-Fi is a little slow here, but you can already see that we've just added one render to it and we still have the same map. We have the same base map where we're looking at the same extents. We're just going to symbolize the data a little bit differently. So now we can see. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we create our default symbol that we have right up here. It's going to be a simple fill symbol, and we're going to give it a color and a width for the outline of the symbol. That's our default symbology for information that doesn't fall into our categories. Next thing we do is create a renderer. I'll blow this up a little bit more, make it easier to see. So we're going to have a simple renderer, and you see right in the comments, it's autocast as new simple renderer. So you could go in the API reference and find a require statement for simple renderer, but you don't have to. The symbol we're going to assign is the default symbology we set up above. We're going to give it a label, and then we're going to use something called visual variables, which is a really cool way of rendering information. Visual variables basically lets you create a continuous color ramp from the starting value to the ending value, or you can actually assign specific colors for specific values. So here I have these stops set up, and so for values of 0.044 or less, it's going to give it this color. For values of this magnitude, it's going to give you this color, and so on. So if you know your data well, you can say this is how I want to symbolize it. I want to go from like a light blue to a dark purple. Light blue will be less, dark purple will be more. And that tells a very easy story to understand. So now I'm going to have, that was for the polygon layer that you saw before. Now we're going to create a renderer for the point layer. And we're actually going to use a simple marker symbol for that. So I'm going to create a var centroid renderer. It's going to be type simple. The symbol is going to be a pixel marker, which I define a URL for. So you can find a URL for a PNG file on the internet, or you can actually host one locally. You can assign that to your data. So if you have a really cool image that you worked on for your company or perhaps for your school system, you can apply your own custom image to your point value. And then you can assign your own width and height. And obviously, based on the dimension of the actual image, you want to play around with that to see what looks best. Okay, so we have our default symbology. We have two pretty sweet renders. Now we're actually going to add that to our layers. So we have our points layer, which is a new feature layer. We just apply the URL, and then we tell it what renderer to have, and it's done. Then we do the same thing for a polygon layer. We create a new feature layer from the polygons. We give it a URL, and we apply the renderer, and that's done. We also have a few things here like outfields, which will be helpful when we talk about pop-ups later, and opacity. Opacity is like transparency. The opacity can also be assigned in the renderer, but here we can also do it in the feature layer. So then the setup is the same. We create our var map, we create our new map view, and then we add, using a view.when statement, we add both those layers to the map. And what we're left is this beautiful representation of private and public school attendance in the United States. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn over to Heather, and she's going to take you through some pop-ups.
All right, so now we have our maps, we added our layers, we have everything rendered the way we want it to be. That's great and all, but we probably you're going to want to have some sort of interaction with that map as well. So that's where pop-ups come into play. A pop-up basically allows you to interact with your map based on your mouse click. So wherever you click, you're going to get a pop-up to display specific information that you have specified within your application. So pop-up, you can get the pop-up directly off of the view itself and set content directly within that pop-up off of the view. You can also set your content using the pop-up template that you get off of a feature layer. So if we take a look at the feature layer, if I can type, feature layer class, and go to the pop-up template, you'll see basically just takes this, it takes a reference to a pop-up template, and then from here, and as you can see, based on this tiny little scroll bar, there is a lot of information of how you can go in here and specify and set the content that you're working with. In our example, we're setting our content based off of field information that we have within our feature layer. So you can pass in fields. You can also set your pop-up equivalent to, like, you can set charts. You can pass in images. That would be a media type of an element that you would add within your pop-up. You can set content for your pop-up based off of some function calls that you have. So whatever that function returns, you can pass that into your pop-up. Promises, once your promise is resolved, you can pass that into the content of your pop-up. You can even pass in DOM nodes to content as content of your pop-up. If we take a look, so that feature click that I was telling you about, it's going to get, in this case, it gives you the information on your attributes. It's also, you can also get the location of where you clicked. And another thing is if you're working with, let's say, the search widget, which we'll talk about just quickly, you can also set up the pop-up template for the results that you get from that search. Okay, and it is fully customizable as well. So I do want to show you an example of this. One other thing here. So I talked about all of this. We can position the pop-up as well using, there's a doc options property off of the view pop-up class. Okay, so using the doc options, we can say, hey, I want the pop-up to be positioned in the upper left, lower left, upper right, whatever it may be. We have a view UI provided to you. You can set then how you want that pop-up to automatically show. Or maybe you don't want it to just be hovering around by that feature that you clicked on. Maybe you want to have it automatically dock to a specific location. You can do that as well. So let's go in and take a quick look. All right, so the same app, but now let's go in. I remember looking at this data, and I think Pennsylvania was at the top. So it's a concentration of private school enrollment. And I have the pop-ups configured to work with the polygon layer. So if I click on it, you'll see here I have it automatically set so that it docks here on the right-hand side. And what I have here is I have an array of fields that I'm showing. So a few different fields. And then I have a couple charts. So I'm showing a pie chart, and I'm showing a bar chart. Okay. So how do I actually have this written? If you take a look at the code, all right, you'll see here I'm creating a new instance of a pop-up template, passing in the title, and this is where it's quite a bit. If you take a look at the content property, you can pass in an array of, in this case, I have field information. So you just specify the type, which is fields, and then I'm passing in what it is that I want to actually have shown up within my, my display. So what the field name is, and then how I want to have that labeled. So I have quite a few fields in here. And then I'm passing in an array of media info. So in this case, I'm working with charts. I could also be working with images as well. You need to make sure that you specify the right type. In this case, it's media. And then I'm just passing in the fields that I want these charts to be representing. These are just two different types of elements. You can work with attachments. You can work with just straight text and put in some whatever HTML customizations that you want to have displayed. You can set all of that within your content. And again, all of that is written up directly within the pop-up template SDK documentation. So if we go back to the code, you'll see here, so I just created that pop-up template. And now, in that private schools poly feature layer that we have, you'll notice here I have an additional pop-up template property where I am specifying that pop-up template that I just created above here. And that's it. All right. Okay, yeah. So you may want to, we just talked a little bit about pop-ups. So now we can talk a little bit about filtering out your data. You can filter out your data based upon definition expressions. So only show data based upon a certain, you might set up a SQL query and say specify how that data should be displayed based upon this query statement. A lot of times, again, you're going to want to use these, like if you have large data sets and you just want to narrow some things down. You also can filter data based upon actual feature layer queries itself. So if we take a quick look at a demo here, I got to make this smaller, it's too big. All right, if we take a look here at this demo, you'll see here I have a drop down listing all the states. If I click on one, go to Pennsylvania, you can see here, just zooms to that location. So if we take a quick look at the code behind it, and I'm just going to do a quick search for query, I know that, so basically when my view is ready, I'm going to watch for when this polygon layer is fully loaded. Once that layer is fully loaded, I'm going to query all of the features. That's an empty, I'm not passing any query in here. So this is basically saying query all of the features. Once those features are queried, return those results. We're going to iterate through all of these results, and I'm going to get my feature ID and then the state name, that unique value. So I'm going to query out my features, and based upon this, I'm going to create that DOM that you saw for all that dropdown. Once I have that, I'm going to go in here and then select whatever state that I've selected. I'm going to go in and set that definition expression based upon whatever the FID was. Okay, and then view, we have a go-to method off of the view that'll zoom to that location. All right. Okay, there you go.
All right. So we looked at some really awesome coding examples of how to do a lot of cool visualizations and add data to the map. There is another way though. So how many people here are familiar with ArcGIS Online? Okay, a good number of you. One of the cool things about ArcGIS Online is you can create rendering, you can create symbology, you can create pop-ups. All the work that we've just shown you can be done in ArcGIS Online, and then you can save it to your web map. And what's cool about the JavaScript API is then you can consume that web map and be done. So this can really limit the amount of coding that you need to do on a project. And one web map can be shared with multiple people or with multiple applications. So here is the code snippet that shows you the entire power of working with the API. You simply create a new web map and assign it to your variable map. And then you add in a portal item, which is Autocast. You don't need to worry about that module. And give it that long, gnarly string. And then you'll have a beautiful web application that you created. So let's take a look at a demo of what that will look like. And believe it or not, it's going to look really similar to the sample that you saw before. So prior to the conference, Heather went in and made a web map that uses the exact same code that we used before, except she used the GUI interface in ArcGIS Online. And to prove it, we can go into the console and we can look at the actual code that was in there. And I'll refresh it again. It's so much faster on your machine.
I cached it all.
Yeah, smart. All right, and you see we just have a couple statements. We create our web map. We assign it a portal item, give it that long, gnarly item ID, and then just add that map to the view, and we're done. And so sometimes your projects don't involve a lot of coding. You can actually do it easily in ArcGIS Online, or using ArcGIS Enterprise if you're using that for your organization. So there's another alternative to writing code is actually just to use a little bit of a code snippet.
Open up that again. Open up your sample. Click on some of the areas, show the pop-ups.
Oh, that's right. So the pop-ups are also, make it a little smaller. They're in here as well, the same as they were with the application that we showed you earlier. So you can come in here and interact with it just the same as before.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Heather, and she's going to take it home.
Yeah, just as a side note, I always tell people, if at all possible, I always go that route now. It's just so much easier. If all you're trying to do is just bring in a pre-rendered map, you don't want to have to worry about writing out all the code for the customizations, the pop-up, and so forth. I mean, look at all of this. Look at all these lines I have. This is just the rendering, all right? And all you have to do is just pass in the web map ID and specify the portal item number. That's it. So just keep that in mind, just a few lines of code as opposed to a lot more on this end. So we talked a little bit about the map interactivity. We talked about rendering and so forth. Now let's actually talk a little bit about working with widgets. So all a widget is it encapsulates specific functionality within a widget or a class, a widget class. So we have a bunch of predefined widgets that are provided to you within the API in 3 and in 4. The 4 widgets that we have here, and they are going to be very similar to what you had in 3, like directions, search, zoom, pop-ups, print, and so forth. Okay. In this particular demo, we're going to focus on the legend widget and the search widget. So one thing I wanted to mention and touch upon was the coding patterns that you use and work with when you're working with widgets are going to be similar. It doesn't matter the type of widget that you're working with, the coding pattern is always going to remain the same. So again, remember back with the feature layers, just coding patterns remain the same regardless of the feature layer. You require, instantiate, properties, add. Widgets, same exact thing. You require the correct widget, you instantiate the widget, you set the properties for the widget, and then you add the widget to the view. Back with 3, you had to create a view, you had to create a div within your markup, and then you would pass that source DOM node property of that widget for the div into that when you instantiated your view. You can still do that, but there is an easier way now. We actually provide you a view UI, a default view UI, which allows you to work and add your widgets just right off the bat. So you just view.ui.add. You can move them. So if you have a responsive app, you can move your widgets based upon some certain functionality or some certain conditions that you have set, or you can remove them. You can tell it then, so in this particular case, we're saying add the legend, add the search widget. I'm telling it then the location. So we have predefined locations that you can set it to as well. And again, all of that in the documentation with some samples and some syntax to show you how to do that. So let's take a quick look. I have this open already. So what I've done here is I've created the legend widget to show the private school enrollment. And then I'm just showing, because this is just centroids of the same exact data, I'm just showing a legend of this particular layer, that polygon layer. And then I have a search widget in here. So this search widget, it's kind of cool about the search widget is that you can configure sources within the search widget to search either based on a location, like a locator service. By default, that's going to go to the ArcGIS Online geocoding the world geocoding service. Or you can pass in a feature layer and set what it is, like what you want to search for within that feature layer. So in this particular case, I have it set that within my search widget, I'm going to search based upon that state name, the state name for this polygon layer that we're working with. So if I went in, you'll see I've got my suggestions that show up. Click on Pennsylvania, and it automatically zooms to that location. And there's a pop-up template property that you can pass in that search widget. So I basically just took that pop-up template that I have from this data and set that then to show instead as the default for that search widget. All right, so if we look at the code, you'll see here, I stuck with using the portal item. All right, just to try to make things a little bit easier, to shorten that code up a little bit. So we're working with that portal item that Noah just showed you. And then what I have here is I have this map.layers get item at. So I'm getting the first layer within that, that map that we just brought in. Now I'm going to create a legend. I'm going to pass the view in. So the view, you're always going to see this view property. You need to pass that view property in so it knows which widget, which view to associate this widget with. Because again, like I said, you can have multiple views within your application. And then you have a layer infos property, and you can pass an array of layers. We're only working with one in this particular case, and that's that polygon one. And then here we have our search widget. So remember I was talking about the sources? So I pass in that sources property, I'm passing in my feature layer, and I'm getting the URL off of that polygon layer, and I'm using that, passing that in for the URL of the feature layer. I need to give it out fields, so it has all of the fields that it can access, passing in my pop-up template, and then some of just the additional information, like what I actually want to search based off of, if it needs to have an exact match, and so forth. And then lastly, I'm telling it where exactly I want these widgets to be placed. So the bottom left, top right, so forth. So again, like I mentioned, it doesn't really matter which widget it is that you're working with, the concepts are going to remain the same. All right, so we just dumped a whole lot of information on you guys at one time. I know it's a lot to process, especially if you guys are brand new to all of this. So before, if anything you can get from this session is where the SDK documentation is and how to go about getting through it. So definitely take note of the API reference, the samples, guide topics. It is where you should be going first and foremost if you have any questions. We have trainings, we've got webinars, some paid, some you need to pay for, some you don't. There is a lot of online training that you can do within JavaScript, not just our stuff. JavaScript's huge. There's different flavors across the board, so there's all types of training. So definitely just get on in there, don't be afraid, just play around. We've got, again, Noah talked about the GeoNet forum, we've got spatial communities in Slack, that's a good one. So again, and we don't have these additional sessions anymore. So again, thank you. We take your feedback really seriously, and we use that when we are making these sessions. We try to improve on them. So please fill out the survey. We have a few minutes for questions. If there's no one else, there's no one else coming in after this, so we can stick around and answer some questions. Or if you want to ask a question right now and do it, if you're not shy, that's fine as well. So, anybody? Y'all are hungry. Okay, I get it.
We'll say go get some lunch and thank you for your time. But
Yeah,
we'll
we'll
be
be
up
in the
here
showcase.
if you want to chat.
So, yeah.